Welcome to episode 117. It's our eighth standalone episode of the G2 on 5G. It's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. Today, Anshel and I welcome Dave Wright, who's president of the OnGo Alliance. Welcome, Dave, to the podcast.
Thanks, Will. Thanks, Anshel. Very nice to be here.
Yeah, great. Well, before we jump into the crux of our conversation, many of our viewers and listeners may not know that you have a day job and you lead the global wireless policy at HPE. So before we kind of jump into everything, you want to talk a little bit about what you do there?
Sure. I mean, certainly here representing the OnGo Alliance. Yeah, for my day job, I head up the wireless policy initiatives for Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, particularly for our Aruba Networks group. And so I spend my time, thinking about what the spectrum needs and policy needs are going to be for different wireless technologies, a year, 5 years, 10 years from now, and then working with our product teams and our CTO office, which I'm a part of, try to translate that into what's going on at the typically national and international level with spectrum and wireless policy and technology policy in general. So lots of interactions with the FCC in the U.S., NTA on the federal spectrum side, Congress, executive branch as well. So yeah, that's a domestic picture, and then they have counterparts around the world and different international groups, so ITU type activities. So yeah, it's a fascinating realm, and none of what we know and enjoy today with our wireless world and our increasingly wireless world would be possible, without the spectrum that the regulators make available to us.
You're absolutely right. And, most recently that came at a pretty penny, right?
Yeah, when you license it and sell it for an auction, it can get expensive.
Yeah,
Generate good revenues for the treasury. Yeah.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, let's jump in. Thanks for sharing a little bit of background there. So I know you spoke to both Anshel and I separately over the last several weeks, but I was wondering, to get started, can you provide kind of a brief update regarding the OnGo Alliance, namely recent member additions and device certifications?
Sure, and just as background for any of your listeners, viewers who just don't have any idea who OnGo Alliance is. And it was funny. I was having lunch with my 21-year-old son today, who's just getting into sort of the networking technology field. He's like, "There's so many darn alliances out there," and I was like, "Yeah, we tend to do that in networking." So the OnGo Alliance, formerly the CBRS Alliance, is a group of companies that came together, really started, the genesis of all of this was the 2015 timeframe. And it was all about bringing products and solutions to market that would capitalize on this new citizens broadband radio service here in the US. And this is in the 3.5 gigahertz band, where we are opening up spectrum that had previously been mostly occupied by federal operations, actually military operations. So we're opening up that spectrum. There are some commercial incumbent operations as well, but we're doing it in a really innovative way using these essentially geolocation databases called spectrum access systems, or SASs. And the SASs are, again, these are centralized cloud services run by a number of different companies and organizations. And you contract with them, and then if you want to operate a LTE or a 5G radio network or access network, your radios will actually talk to these spectrum access system databases, and they'll let them know, "Hey, I'm at this location. I'm this type of radio." That could be indoors or outdoors, low power, high power, few other parameters. So I'm at this location and I'd like some spectrum. And the SASs have awareness of the overall band in that specific area or geographic area, the incumbent operations, the other CBRS users. And so they'll come back with a spectrum grant to the radio that authorizes them to then operate. And it's really, this is, CBRS is one example of a broader trend, and sort of just putting on my spectrum policy wonk hat for a second. It's part of this broader trend towards dynamic spectrum access. So, we've long lived in a world where spectrum was sort of bifurcated, just this sort of linear distinction between licensed spectrum, like what you said, generates billions of dollars when you auction it. The revenue very popular with Congress right now because they can use it to pay for all sorts of exciting things. Or on the other hand, you had unlicensed spectrum, which is sort of a free-for-all, no interference protections, non-exclusive, no exclusive rights to the spectrum like you would get with licensed spectrum, but creates a real fertile, playground, if you will, for innovation. Has given rise to Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and so many other exciting things that we all take advantage of, use on a daily basis. So with this dynamic spectrum access, we're really sort of moving beyond that. I'm going to call it bipolar world that we've had with licensed, unlicensed. And we, with CBRS, we actually have both protected access, which is similar to fully licensed spectrum historically. And we also have an opportunistic tier of CBRS called general authorized access, which is more of the quasi unlicensed uses. So it's really mixing things. And I think it's, again, CBRS is just one example of this. The 6 gigahertz unlicensed is going to use a thing called automated frequency coordination, which is also DSA. So I just want to give people a little bit of background on what, the CBRS framework is and what's going on with dynamic spectrum access. And I can loop back to your question on the Alliance if you would like me to. Sorry, I know I kind of did a lot of setup there.
No, that's great. And it's been a real model, right? You and I have spoken in the past, and you're actually sharing some of the learnings of what I call the democratization of traditionally licensed spectrum with different parts of the world. But yeah, real briefly, what are some of the newest members? And we also talked about device certifications recently too.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, we launched the Alliance in August of 2016 with 6 founding members. We're up to about 200 members, companies now. It's a bit of a who's who. We have all of the major players in the mobile industry, the cable industry on the operator side, big technology names, Google, Facebook, et cetera. And then, neutral host tower companies, cellular infrastructure vendors, enterprise wireless LAN companies, chipset folks, integrators. So the list of members is wide and distinguished. Some of the newest members that you asked about, we're really getting a lot of folks in who are like focusing on, I'd say, the systems integration, how to kind of put solutions together and bring those to market. So GS Labs has joined recently. Some antenna specialization companies, so Huber and Sooner. Aleph Edge, who's doing some interesting things both around sort of mobile edge compute for the enterprise, particularly important to some of the private networks use cases. Pollen Mobile's another one that's joined recently. They've got an interesting sort of crypto mining based on private network deployments. So those are just a few examples of some of our newest members. On the kind of device counts and deployment counts, we're up to 230,000, over 230,000 deployed base stations, which in CBRS are known as CBSDs. So you'll sometimes hear us using that acronym. So over 230,000 CBRS small cells typically in deployment and operation being coordinated by these spectrum access systems that we talked about. And that's, I think, far and away the largest small cell deployment that's ever occurred in a mid-band frequency, I think in any frequency really, globally. So we're proud of that. We've had our FCC authorization now for full commercial operations since January of 2020, so about 2.5 years now. So we've done 230,000 plus base station deployments in that 2.5 years. On the device side, which I think is probably a better metric for how a new ecosystem, a new wireless ecosystem is developing and how vibrant it is. And it's particularly relevant for CBRS because, as you said, we're kind of democratizing this. We're really on the front edge of the whole private networks, movement globally. And so, because of that, we've now got over 400, well, I think it's actually at 435 different models of client devices that have been authorized for operation in the band for either LTE or 5G, some cases actually supporting both. But 435 different client devices, and the form factors there on the client side are fascinating because we certainly have the mobile devices, the handsets, the smartphone that is, as well as the tablet form factors and things like that. But then it goes into more of the notebook and notebook form and laptop type form factors. So more traditional computing models supporting CBRS. And then even more interesting is sort of the, I'll say at the industrial, industrial specific. So we got a whole range of gateways and routers that really are meant for industrial manufacturing or even vehicular type deployments, farm machinery, all sorts of interesting things. John Deere was one of the companies that bought one of the protected access licenses at the CBRS auction a few years ago.
Yeah.
And then there's a number of customer premise equipment. So fixed wireless access is actually a very popular use case for the CBRS band. And so in those deployments, you typically would have a residential CPE device that would, get the CBRS sort of broadband connection from a tower, a few kilometers away. And then use Wi-Fi in the house. But so there's a range of these sort of CPE gateway devices. And then we've got some really interesting mission-specific client form factors, barcode scanners, security cameras, people finding really interesting things to do with CBRS and sort of driving the client device manufacturers to support it. It's much more analogous to a Wi-Fi-like ecosystem than to a traditional licensed cellular band.
Yeah. No, I mean, you've been doing quite a bit since 2016, and you touched on LTE and 5G, and I think that's a great segue for Anshel's first question for you.
Yeah. So Dave, you mentioned CBRS, and how it's key to the OnGo Alliance. And I was really, wondering about how, CBRS was originally focused on private LTE, but where are you guys at today with 5G deployments, and what does the typical industry or vertical profile of a customer look like?
Okay, great questions, and I'm going to treat that as two separates if I could. So on the question about LTE and 5G, yeah, I mean, so again, a little trip back down sort of memory lane here. The work that sort of culminated with CBRS coming into commercial service began in really the 2011 timeframe, if not earlier. And so, as the initial studies were done by, the government, that is NTIA and the FCC, LTE was really somewhat of an emerging technology still. And so that was really what was in mind when the initial conversations about CBRS were had. And even as it came to fruition through the FCC's processes and the industry standardization processes, it was all still essentially an LTE world at that time. And one of the things I like to point out is this ecosystem that we just talked about, and how vibrant it is, and how many devices we have. That is a direct result of the fact that the frequency range that we're talking about, which is 3550 to 3700 megahertz, that directly overlaps with some global LTE TDD bands, or time division duplexing bands. So since 2008 timeframe, I believe, is when 3GPP standardized those, band 42 and band 43, heavily used in Japan for a long time. And then, there was some use in Europe, and now they're 5G pioneer bands almost globally. So we benefited directly from that because there was Qualcomm and other companies were making chips for those frequency ranges for other markets, and so we could ride that wave. So I say all of this to say that there was a large, well-established LTE ecosystem, from the chipsets to the infrastructure radios to the client devices. that we immediately were able to essentially capitalize on. And so really up until 2018, really the focus of, the industry activity, the CBRS Alliance, as we were known at that point, was all around LTE operation in CBRS. And I didn't really talk too much about it, but one of the things that we were looking at is, LTE had always operated an exclusively licensed spectrum. It didn't have to be concerned about sharing with other operators, particularly in the same channel. So there's just some kind of nuances or new aspects of operating LTE in a shared spectrum space like we have with CBRS. And so that's really been our focus, I would say, is really optimizing these 3GPP technologies to operate in a shared spectrum band. And we think that's going to be incredibly important going forward. But it was LTE focused, call it till about January of 2018. And I think it was at that point, I think it was January of 18 that our board made a decision to begin working on 5G new radio operation in the band. We started off some activity within our technical working group, and we actually published our first 5G specifications for CBRS in 2020. And so we were the first, actually at the end of 2019. So we were the first mid-band frequencies in the US that were actually available for 5G NR operation. And we're proud of that. Some of the FCC commissioners were very excited to say they'd made mid-band 5G available, and that was us. So that has all happened. These cellular G cycles tend to be about a decade long. We're still pretty early in the 5G cycle. So the ecosystem continues to emerge, I would say, on the 5G side relative to LTE, particularly for the sort of the private standalone mode of operation. That's going to take a little while to get to the same point that we have in terms of LTE devices and the diversity. There's a premium for 5G equipment at this point as well. So what I think we're seeing right now is the operators who are using CBRS. So Verizon has been quite a prominent deployer and utilizer of the spectrum. And there's been a lot of press about what some of the MSOs or cable companies are doing, and they've purchased a lot of the priority access licenses during our auction. So I think those companies have made fairly clear that anything they deploy, even if they deployed it initially as LTE radio, they needed to have an upgrade path to 5G NR, which makes tons of sense given the the amount of effort that they're putting behind their 5G rollouts. So I think we're seeing a lot of a drive from the operators for 5G. I don't think we're seeing as much on the private side yet, with a few exceptions. I mean, there's a few exceptions where when you actually do get to 5G NR SA, so standalone with a 5G core, and you can potentially implement slicing and things like this, that the reductions in latency really have some benefit for precision manufacturing and a few other private deployment models, or use cases, I should say. But for, I'm going to say 95% of the private deployments that are out there today, LTE works extremely well. It's a new capability that they haven't had access to before in the first place, and it's quite a bit less expensive than a 5G solution today.
Yeah, and I think Dave, you also touched on the second question about sort of verticals, and from my perspective as well, when I look at the private kind of cellular opportunity, manufacturing automation, I think is a huge opportunity there. But you and I were speaking a few weeks ago, and you brought up a use case that I found interesting for CBRS spectrum, and you kind of walked me through stadium and venue deployments. And when I typically think of that, all you hear is like what Verizon talks about with their ultra wideband and millimeter wave, for obvious reasons. So what's the story there with CBRS, and how is it exactly getting deployed for stadium and venue management?
Yeah, thanks, Will. I really enjoyed that conversation that we had a few weeks ago on the topic, and it's really hit me this year. So 2022 in particular, we hadn't had an in-person meeting of the Alliance, since whatever, I think it was January or February of 2020. So it had been 2 years since we met. We had our first meeting in April. Our first in-person member meeting was April in Philadelphia. And the timing just was great. And it was kind of great to be back together after 2 years to sort of, and we'd been having virtual online meetings, of course, but, be back in person and really to kind of talk about, wow, there's a lot that's happened in the last 2 years when, well, the world's been sort of hiding in our houses. But one of the things that was really exciting, and I'm trying to get to the point here, sorry, is that being in Philly, Comcast had announced not too long before April that they were doing a CBRS deployment at the Wells Fargo Center, right, which is where the Sixers play, and Villanova and ice hockey, and that is the NHL has a team there, which Flyers. I knew I was going to remember it eventually. Um, so, we're in Philly. Comcast is a member, a great host, and they actually had us over to the to the Wells Fargo Center, gave us a tour, sort of backstage, if you will, showed us, the data center, where some of the radios were deployed and everything. And so this is, it's one of Comcast's showcases. And so, since they're the primary sponsor for the arena, and they talked to us about what they'd rolled out, and they're using it for, sort of operational stuff. So they've got the Jumbotron there over the court / rink. And they, during the game, they'll have, video that they put up there from the crowd, and have people going around in the audience. But because both the licensed band spectrum that the DAS system uses and the unlicensed spectrum that the Wi-Fi, guest Wi-Fi uses, both of those are so heavily taxed that neither was really a good option for them to stream this video with a sort of predictable, result, high quality video experience, et cetera, et cetera. So they're now using CBRS enabled handsets, and tablets, to do that, and they stream that up to the Jumbotron, and they're doing some other, sort of internal communications over CBRS as well. So that's Comcast Center. Then we were in San Diego for our July member meeting, and we didn't really plan any of this, because we actually booked most of these venues like 2 years ago, and then we kept deferring them as the pandemic went on. Yeah. So we had these things booked years in advance, but we got out to San Diego in July, and OnGo, one of our board member companies, actually was doing had done a deployment at Petco Park, and so we actually had the CIO for the Padres come and talk to us about, how they're leveraging technology, what's going on with CBRS. And in Petco Park, they're using it for a portion of the stadium where they they didn't have good connectivity options, and this is I'm going to call it sort of a flex use space. So, they'll do it during the games for refreshments and vendors and souvenirs and these sorts of things. During concerts, they'll have, pop-up kiosks and ticket taking and things like this, but it's a reconfigurable space, and it doesn't look necessarily the same way twice almost. And again, because of how heavily utilized the unlicensed and licensed bands are within the stadium, most of these stadiums, they're using every frequency that they can come across.
Yeah.
And so the same thing, they're using it a lot for sort of flexible point of sale is one of the primary drivers there at Petco. So that was a really cool example. We unfortunately didn't get to tour the facility because they were having a Red Hot Chili Peppers concert. I guess that preempted us, but we got to see it. We were actually looking out over it. And then another one is AT&T Center. So the basketball stadium in Texas, obviously. And the CommScope there, who's a member of the Alliance, is doing a deployment there with AT&T. and they're using, let's see, it's both their DAS system as well as some of the new CBRS small cells are being deployed there. Use cases are mostly around internal communications. So, I think analogous to what we talked about with Wells Fargo, they may be doing some concourse connectivity as well for POS. So, yeah.
Well, you guys are covering one of my favorite sports teams, the San Antonio Spurs, there at the AT&T Center, and Anshel is a huge Padres fan and has season tickets. So yeah, you're covering both of our venues there.
Sweet.
So with that, Anshel, I'm going to hand it over to you for your next question.
Yeah, so Dave, I appreciate that because I've definitely been following the Boingo deployment for obvious reasons. But beyond what you and Will discussed, what are some other compelling use cases for CBS spectrum deployment?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's kind of hard to put your finger on it anymore. I say, one of the things that is so cool about CBRS is it's so flexible. We sort of have 5 primary categories of use cases, is how I'm going to put it. So you've got operators. I mentioned that there's a lot of operator interest in this band, right? It's 150 megahertz of mid-band spectrum that they can use for LTE and 5G. So and it's if you use it at the GAA tier, it's practically free. So who's not going to like that? So you've got on the operator side, you've got mobile operators. Obviously, I mentioned Verizon, typically using this as additional capacity in the metropolitan areas, and so it's another band, either B48 if you're using LTE or N48 if you're using 5G and R, and they can just using carrier aggregation, they can add in a 40 or a 60 or however much spectrum the SAS will grant them in a location. They can add that into their other license bands and give their subscribers, that much more throughput. So mobile operators, and then I mentioned the cable operators. So we've got most of the big ones in the Alliance, Charter, Comcast, Cox are all members. And many of them are looking at CBRS as a way to actually build out some of their own cellular footprint in those metro areas where they've got hybrid fiber coax, infrastructure running all through the streets. They can put up potentially their own small cells, onload their subscribers with, Spectrum Mobile or Xfinity Mobile, and not have to pay an MVNO wholesale fee in that case. So, and then the third major sort of operator category is the fixed wireless piece that we talked about. And so, and that's everybody from the big players, the big MNOs and MSOs looking to extend the reach of their fixed networks, typically, where they've got fiber in the ground or fiber, hybrid fiber coax in the ground. But there's also a whole lot of smaller wireless internet service providers or WISPs operating typically in the rural parts of the country. And they were incumbents in the band, actually. So they have been operating under what was known as Part 90 of the FCC's rules. In the upper 50 megahertz, so from 3650 to 3700, and they've been operating up there for years. But now with CBRS, they're getting access to a full 150 megahertz and much wider channels potentially. And because of this ecosystem that's coming in with LTE and now 5G, it's dynamically changing their economics in a positive way by lowering their cost. And so a lot of deployments are happening with fixed wireless access, particularly these WISP deployments. And that's again why we got such a vibrant customer premise equipment ecosystem. So those are the 3 operator categories: mobile, cable, and fixed wireless. And then on the private/enterprise side, if you will, I have 2 big categories there. And these are not neat categories, by the way. There's a bleed over between all of them, but you have to try to figure out how to do some segmentation. So I would say private networks. So to me, a private deployment is something that you're using for internal communications needs, right? It's not a public network; it's private. So that's one of the 2 sort of enterprise deployment models. The fifth one, and this one isn't really here yet, but it's I think going to be emerging very soon, is neutral host, and this is the ability for a enterprise public venue to deploy, their own LTE or 5G network, potentially use it as a private deployment for internal communications needs, but in the neutral host, sense, to open that up for the subscribers of the mobile operators, of the public mobile operators. So, the idea being, I could put this in my, commercial space, my office space or condo space or multi-tenant dwelling units or student housing or whatever, and I could I could do some IoT sensors and other security cameras and private stuff that I need to do, but then hey, it's here, it's providing a really good LTE signal within a building. Why don't I want to let my students with AT&T get connected, right? And that's the whole neutral host thing. So sorry, 5 major categories, and then I'd love to kind of dive into the private network, some of the verticals there, if you have time.
Yeah, so I mean, that was going to be my final question before we wrapped up. I think what's really compelling about what you're doing, I mean, it's all very compelling, but certainly the private wireless opportunity is super compelling. So yeah, if you could provide, a couple of examples of what you're doing there, and then maybe provide, a reference point if our viewers and listeners want to learn more, maybe the OnGo website. But yeah,
Yeah.
would love you to wrap things up with that.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so if we dive a little bit into that category of private, being internal comms, I think you made the probably the one of the most important points, Will, which is that a lot of the activity that was driven really early on in the U.S. with CBRS, but particularly in countries like Germany and the UK and even Japan now, has been around sort of industrial logistics. Netherlands, Port of Rotterdam, go read some of the use cases there about, they put in, to private LTE, and that happened years ago. The amount of money that they've been able to save, the reliability they've seen as an increase over some unlicensed solutions that they had historically relied on. So the ROI and the economics for, again, major port, rail yard, manufacturing, shipping companies, things like this, if they have an hour of downtime, they're losing, hundreds of thousands of dollars / euros. So, for them, it's a no-brainer. And so we saw a lot of early deployments there. Some of the other ones that we're starting to see that are sort of outside of those industrial logistics ones, I would say, are around retail. So again, particularly that flexible point of sale type solution that we were talking about. Some real interesting municipal deployments in education has been driving a lot of this. It's amazing to me, and I think COVID sort of exacerbated this. But as we had so many students trying to learn from home, it really underscored the disparity that we have in connectivity within the country, and it's not just a sort of urban rural divide. It's just there's also the socioeconomic aspects of this as well. And so we had a number of communities, municipalities around the country roll out CBRS networks to provide connectivity to households that just otherwise would not have had it. And that's been huge. And we've actually had some news recently out of New York, where New York Public Libraries is involved in providing some connectivity to again folks who wouldn't have it otherwise. Venues and hospitality is another interesting use case. Healthcare, lots of interesting models there in terms of, it's analogous to the stadiums in terms of they will typically have a DAS system, and they'll typically have Wi-Fi in a hospital. But what you'll find is, both of those are heavily utilized. The DAS for voice, the Wi-Fi for guest and patient sort of access. And what they're finding is that because of that, neither of those solutions is really well suited for anything that's mission critical. I'm not going to say life critical, but mission critical to the hospital, asset tracking, sort of telemetry of routine type of patient monitoring and things like that. I can't remember if I said asset tracking. So these sorts of uses, and again, hospitals are trying to be very flexible from a space perspective as well, reconfiguring, wards, reconfiguring operating theaters and things like this. And so they're trying to move more and more wireless. So healthcare is an interesting one. Unfortunately, unfortunately, from a technology CBRS momentum perspective, fortunately from a safety and as a patient perspective, they tend to be pretty conservative in how they embrace technology. So we've got some systems that have started to embrace CBRS, and others I think will take a little bit longer on the healthcare side. Those are a few. Retail distribution is, I mentioned retail in terms of the point of sale opportunity. Another really interesting one we're seeing is retail distribution, where, and it's somewhat analogous to sort of the logistics and shipping thing, because you've got these distribution centers where, huge warehouses with pallets, or pardon me, not pallets, but just shelves of products and things. And then they'll have a sort of pallet loading area where in a lot of cases, the newer ones, they have all these wonderful robots flying around the facilities, gathering products off of the shelves, bringing them back, loading a pallet, and preparing the pallet to go out on a truck or train or whatever. But wireless connectivity inside those facilities, has to be rock solid, right? Again, these are ones where an hour of downtime is very significant business consequences, because they've got very strict sort of SLAs with their resale, the end customer, who's a big box retailer typically. And so they're really excited about some of the advantages that having an LTE or a 5G system inside the building provides. The mobility support. I mean, some of these robots are zipping around at 30 or 40 miles an hour inside the building, and they tend to have metal raceways, which creates some really challenging RF environments. And so they're finding that, with an LTE waveform, it's more reliable around these metal obstructions, supports the mobility, very secure. So yeah, that's another one. And, I didn't even know about that until 5 years ago. And all of a sudden it's like one of our big use cases. So.
Awesome. Hey, just to wrap up, Dave, where can our viewers and listeners go to learn more about OnGo?
Yeah, my bad. Sorry. Yes, please. OnGoAlliance.org is our website, and there you'll find everything from private network deployment guides to some neutral host information, what's going on with that. You'll see the list of our members. You can go to the certifications page and look at all those different client devices, as well as the infrastructure radio devices that are there. So it's a great resource. There's some OnGo 101 type resources there for people who just want to understand how all this works as well.
Good stuff. Well, it's been a great podcast. Anshel, why don't you take us home?
Absolutely. We hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. If anyone out there would like to provide insights on a specific 5G topic for a future podcast, please reach out to us on social media. Will is at Whaletown Tech, and I'm at Anshel Saad. Thanks again to Dave Wright from the OnGo Alliance for joining us in an insightful conversation as we lead up to MWC Las Vegas for later this month. Thanks a lot, Dave.
Yeah, thank you, Anshel. Thanks, Will. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dave.